Well, hello. Good to see you today. My Bible is open to Job chapter 16. Job chapter 16. We're going to read a few verses from that chapter before we get into today's reading, which is Job chapter 17. And so we'll say some things about Job's speech that begins in chapter 16, but we'll quickly get into chapter 17, which is today's reading, January the 25th. Thank you for joining me on this wonderful Tuesday. Hope you're doing well. Hope you've got your Bible and you're ready to read along with me. Now, we have gone through the first round of speeches between Job's friends and Job's responses, and now we're into the second round of speeches. In fact, Eliphaz spoke the second time, beginning in chapter 15, and then chapter 16 is Job's response to what Eliphaz has said. And so in chapter 16 and verse 1, Job answered, I have heard many things like these. You are all miserable comforters. Is there no end to your empty words? What provokes you that you continue testifying? Job says, all right, all three of you have spoken. Eliphaz, you've started to speak a second time. And everything that you all have said has not been helpful. The comfort that you're trying to give to me is terrible. Your comfort is actually misery. You are all terrible comforters. Is there no end to these awful, pain-inflicting words that you're saying? Because remember, what have all of them, in essence, said thus far? Job, you must have done something wrong. You must have committed some terrible sin and God's angry with you, and that's why all these bad things are happening to you. You should turn back to God. You should repent and so forth. And he says, you're miserable comforters. You're not helping anything. And then he says what you should be doing instead. Look at chapter 16 and verse 4. If you were in my place, I could also talk like you. I could string words together against you and shake my head at you. Imagine that you were in my position and I was in your position. I could easily say the same kinds of things about you, but I recognize that that would not be helpful, which is why he says in verse 5, instead, I would encourage you with my mouth, and the consolation from my lips would bring relief. I would say things that would actually be a comfort to you instead of beating you down and calling you a wicked person like you're doing to me. And in chapter 16, then Job is going to talk about, but even when I speak my own thoughts about what's happening to me, it doesn't bring relief. And so Job continues on into chapter 17, talking about his situation and his hopes, which he feels like are non-existent. Chapter 17 and verse 1, he says, my spirit is broken. My days are extinguished. A graveyard awaits me. Surely mockers surround me, and my eyes must gaze at their rebellion. The only thing that's left is for me to just die. The only thing that's left is death. In verse 3, he says, accept my pledge. Put up security for me. And then at the end of verse 3, the second part of the verse, the Christian Standard Bible, which, as I said in our first video this year, that's what I'm reading through this year. And so your translation is probably going to read different from mine. He says at the end of verse 3, who else will be my sponsor? Your translation might say, who else is there who will shake hands with me? All right. And that's the idea in both expressions. Someone to be my sponsor. That would be someone who is going to come into an agreement with me to be the pledge. Someone who's going to be, as the book of Proverbs uses this same word for pledge, it talks about being effectively a co-signer on someone's loan, being surety for your neighbor, to use the language of Proverbs. If someone will be a co-signer on my loan, then that means they are making a pledge to pay the debt that I owe in the event that I don't pay that debt that I'm responsible for. And so Job is calling out and he is asking for someone to be his pledge. And really, he's calling for God to be his pledge, to be his co-signer, as it were. And he says, I need God to stand with me. I need him to be my pledge. I need him to shake his hand, shake my hand in agreement with me here. I think this is a way for Job to say he is reaching out to God for God's assistance and encouragement. God is his final hope. He's the last thing that Job has to hold on to. And so he says, I need God to accept my pledge, to join me and to come alongside me here. And now in verse 4 of chapter 17, he says, you have closed their minds to understanding, therefore you will not honor them. I think that statement is directed at God, but it is spoken about his friends. You, God, have closed their minds. It's just another way of saying they're not capable of understanding what I'm going through, which is manifested by their poor judgment in their testimony and what they're saying to Job about what is happening. If a man, verse 5, denounces his friends for a price, the eyes of his children will fail. Again, I think that's about his friends. And I think what he is saying there is, my friends are no help to me at all, just like a man who would give up his friends for maybe a bribe, or maybe in some kind of extortion or something. Well, I'll sell out my friends if the price is right. And he says that's what my friends are doing to me. They're selling me out, and I'm not getting any benefit from them. In fact, what I'm getting is punches to the gut from them. They are not helpful to me at all. They do not understand what is going on. Now, in chapter 17 and verse 6, Job is going to begin talking yet again about what God is doing to him in his suffering. Several times throughout Job's speeches and reflections thus far, he has talked about how God is the one who is inflicting this pain and this punishment on him. He has made me, verse 6, an object of scorn to the people. I have become a man people spit at. My eyes have grown dim from grief, and my whole body has become but a shadow. The upright are appalled at this, and the innocent are roused against the godless. Yet the righteous person will hold to his way, and the one whose hands are clean will grow stronger. But come back and try again, all of you. I will not find a wise man among you. There are some statements here where Job is saying, God is the one who has done this to me, and everybody is seeing what I'm experiencing. In verse 6, he mentions that he is an object of scorn to all the people, and that people find him so hideous and disgusting. And he says, I've become somebody that people will spit upon because of how just how hideous I am in my situation, and how depressed and terrible. Remember, Job's got these boils all over his skin, and he's scraping those boils with pottery, and I'm sure he is not something very pleasing to look at right now. And people all around are seeing Job's suffering and his pain. Remember the way that Job is described early in the book. He is described as this man of tremendous integrity. He is described as a man who's extremely wealthy. Job probably has a lot of people who know who he is, and people who, maybe they've done business dealings with Job, they've traded with Job, and they know that he's a man of integrity and honesty, and he has extreme wealth and all of these things. And now all this bad stuff has happened to Job, and people can see it. And people are just repulsed at what they see in this man who used to be so great and strong and good and honest and blessed. And now he seems to be the most cursed man on the earth, right? And so Job says, just look at how everybody's looking at me, and how people are just appalled at what they see when they look at me. And yet, verse 9, the righteous person will hold to his way. Righteous people will hold on to their courage and to their faith, and they will push through these challenging times, and they will hold on to their way. And I think that's what Job is saying. You know what? I recognize that's what I have to do. I have to be able to push through this, and to not lose sight of God in all of this. And on the other side, I will come out stronger and come out ahead here. I think as we read through these reflections that Job is giving, we will see that Job, on the one hand, he says these things about God where, God is the one who's punishing me. God is the one who's responsible for all of this. He is afflicting me. He is doing all these things. And when we read that, we kind of think, oh, Job is turning his back on God. He is saying these things about God, and he is sinning against God even by saying these things about God's character and so forth. And yet, at the same time, there are other expressions in the speeches that indicate, no, Job is actually holding on to God because God's the only one that he has left. He's the only thing that Job still has to hold on to. So look at chapter 17 and verse 11. We'll continue his speech. My days have slipped by, my plans have been ruined, even the things dear to my heart. They turned night into day and made light seem near in the face of darkness. Verse 12 is kind of a challenging verse. I understand verse 12 to be talking about Job's friends. And he says, the friends are trying, I'm rewording this, I'm paraphrasing this. They're trying to turn night into day. They are trying to make good out of a bad situation in their explanations. They're trying to help. In reality, they're not being helpful at all. In fact, they're immensely hurting Job. They're trying to make good out of something bad. And the way that they speak, they just make it seem so easy. And it's almost as if they could make the light seem near even in the midst of darkness. Job, all you have to do is turn back to God. All you have to do. Well, that sure sounds easy, right? It's almost like, they think there's just a simple solution to all of this. And so I think Job is talking about his friends in verse 12. So in verse 13, if I await Sheol as my home, spread out my bed in darkness, and say to corruption, you are my father, and say to the maggot, my mother or my sister, where then is my hope? Who can see any hope for me? If all I have to look forward to is death, and all I have when he talks about, I know it's kind of gross, but in verse 14, he talks about the maggots. He's talking about corruption and his flesh decaying. And if that's all that I have to look forward to, then what hope do I have, right? And Job is thinking through all of this. And yet, I think Job is really struggling with everything he has here to hold on to God. He's not just casting God aside and dismissing it. He's really struggling to hold on to God. Remember back in chapter 13 that Job just was begging for this opportunity to reason with God. If I could just stand before God, if I could just plead my case before God, if I was just given that opportunity. Job has lost all confidence in his friends, Not to mention his wife. You remember her in chapter 2 when she said, just curse God and die. I mean, she's left him. His friends haven't left his side, but they're not being helpful. He has no confidence in them, but he cannot give up on God. And Job understands that. He cannot give up on God. He's got to hold on to him because no one else can bring back peace and hope to Job's life. That's chapter 17. Thanks for reading along with me today. Take care.